Hello and welcome to the Tudor Her Story. Today we are discussing Lady Margaret Beaufort with author and historian Nathen Amin. Nathen Amin is an author from Carmarthenshire, West Wales, who focuses on the 15th century and the reign of Henry VII. He has written 5 books, most recently Son of Prophecy, The Rise of Henry Tudor. Nathen is an experienced public speaker and features regularly on TV. As of 2020, he is a trustee and founding member of the Henry Tudor Trust, and in 2022 was elected as a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society. Let's get into today's episode. Hello, Nathen. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. How are you doing today?
Yeah, not bad. Just always good to chat history in the morning. Sets up the day well.
I mean, it certainly does. It makes my day feel better. So today we're discussing Lady Margaret Beaufort, but before we get onto her, I thought we could discuss yourself. And I was wondering, when did you first become interested in history?
I mean, I was always interested in history at school. It was one of the subjects I enjoyed doing. The problem was at my particular school, when we were doing GCSEs, we were made to pick a subject. It had to be geography or history. That was the only choice. And they were my two favorite subjects. I was persuaded to go down the geography route, which was a big mistake, and history fell by the wayside. But, I'd always enjoyed reading history in general, but it was in my 20s, really, that I started to become quite fascinated in Tudor history specifically. So you do hear a lot of historians, they've been obsessed with Elizabeth I or Richard III when they were children. That wasn't the case for me. I don't even remember doing the Tudors at school. But in my 20s, I did become more hooked on the story initially of Henry VIII before very quickly noticing he had a Welsh dad from the same area that I was from, who is effectively, a self-made man. When I look at Henry VIII, there's something of the spoilt brat about him. A boy who grew up with everything and was sure of his own place in the world. I much prefer Henry Tudor, his father's story. And really, once I started doing my own research, I started doing my own blogs about it, it has just gradually grown to the point that I'm sitting in my hoodie having a chat with you about all of this stuff.
When did you know that when you were drew to Henry VII, did you know that you wanted to write a book about him?
Not initially, because I never even knew that was a possibility. I studied journalism at university, so I've clearly always wanted to do writing of some form. But I didn't know how that was. I come from a background in an area where that path is not shown to you. I didn't grow up around book writers or journalists or that simply wasn't something I noticed around me. That it's that whole you need to see what you want to be kind of philosophy. So I didn't know that was possible. But I did start writing blogs because, we're talking 2008, 2009, the start of blog culture. And I was doing some basic travel writing. I was writing sports blogs, basically just getting my inner journalist out, whilst, having a normal job. And then, lo and behold, a publisher had seen some of my blogs and got in contact with me and said, would I like to write a small book for them? And it's just from there, slowly one small door opens. You learn, what's presented to you in that room. Then you move on to another door. It's picking up things gradually. Some people are shown this from a young age and come out into the history sphere fully formed.
Hmm.
From a young age, they have an agent, they have access to contacts. Some of us have to try and work it out for ourselves. So no, I didn't initially know that I could write a book about the subject, but I'm glad that's where it ended up being.
Your most recent publication is Sons of Prophecy, and it's about it's the rise of Henry Tudor and before him as well.
Yeah, it's essentially a 300-year history of the Tudor family, but before they become the Tudors. It is ending at 1485. It ends when Henry Tudor becomes King Henry VII. But it takes a very long look at how that happened. Where did this family come from? Historically, if people have even bothered to look at Henry Tudor in the first place, before rather than jumping directly to Henry VIII, they mainly just say, "Oh, Henry VII was son of Margaret Beaufort, descended very poorly uh, from a king of England, and that's it." They don't bother to look at his father's lineage and see where this incredible Welsh family, how they were able to survive for hundreds of years, fighting the English, basically,
Mm.
um, before they somehow become kings of England themselves. It's an utterly remarkable story and one that isn't really told
Mm.
at all until now, I guess.
I mean, I think you're correct. I mean, we just heard Lady Margaret Beaufort. We don't hear about the Welsh ancestors. And I think Henry VII, I believe, was very proud of his Welsh heritage as well.
That would be my interpretation of it. I mean, I think historically, the Welsh part has been written out by English
Mm.
historians. A lot of what we know about history today, about any subject, has been shaped by the Victorians. They were trying to put across a very particular view of the world that they believed in. They're living in a time of British Empire. They're living in a time of English exceptionalism. They have shaped the world in their writing, how they viewed it. And one of the things they've taken out of Henry's story is his Welshness, which has led to historians and people today to believe he didn't care about his Welsh background. And by going beyond the Victorians to actually study the sources, you can see, or at least I would say, I can see that's not true.
Would you say there was there was a lot of sources about the origins of the Tudors?
Yeah, because one of the things that Henry does when he becomes king, one of the first things he does is he orders a commission to take place to go into Wales to look at his family background. Because in the run up to becoming king, Richard III has been making fun of his Welsh background. He's been, this guy's just a Welshman. How can he be king of England? Um, and Henry calls it slanderous assertions on his background, and he wants to correct this. See, he sends people into Wales to research his background, and we still have this evidence. So because of Henry Tudor himself doing a family tree, basically, we have a very good building block to start to do the research. And in Welsh history circles, we've always known about this family because they're one of the most important Welsh families of the medieval period. They weren't nobodies. They were nobodies if you're thinking of great English barons in Westminster, but to the Welsh, they were very important people. So we do know quite a lot about them through things such as poetry, for example.
I mean, I think it's really interesting, but obviously we're here to talk about the mother of Henry VII, Margaret Beaufort. So, who were Margaret's parents, and do we know when she was born?
So Margaret was born in a place called Bletsoe in Northamptonshire on the 31st of May, 1443. Her mother was a lady called Margaret Beauchamp. She was, a standard lady for the day, descended from various um, gentry blood. Her father was a guy called John Beaufort. Now, John Beaufort is interesting because he was at this time the head of the Beaufort family. Now, who were the Beauforts? Well, John of Gaunt was one of the most powerful and richest noblemen in the 14th century. Anyone who's listening is likely going to have heard the name John of Gaunt. But John of Gaunt had a bunch of illegitimate children with one of his nurses called Catherine Swynford. And these illegitimate children were given the name Beaufort. And they became a very powerful family in the 15th century as kind of half Lancastrians. So they were very close and connected and related to the House of Lancaster because they shared this connection with John of Gaunt, who is the father of the House of Lancaster. So our John Beaufort is, let me work it out. So he's the son of another John Beaufort, who is the son of John of Gaunt. So, he's a grandson of John of Gaunt. And John of Gaunt, of course, himself is a son of Edward III. So the Beauforts have royal blood. So Margaret Beaufort's father, John Beaufort, is descended directly from a king of England. And this gives Margaret Beaufort some royal blood. Now, of course, it's the 15th century. There's a lot of people with royal blood. Margaret Beaufort's royal blood is considerable, but there are other people with much grander claims of royal blood in their veins. But what's interesting is that when Margaret Beaufort was 1 year old, her father, John Beaufort, he dies. Now, history has written this that John Beaufort died by suicide. He had spent much of his life in a French prison, or at least, as a French prisoner rather than in prison. He'd been captured after a battle and he was being held for ransom, but no one could afford the ransom. So for 20 years, John Beaufort remained in French hands. Finally, in his 40s, he was ransomed and he comes back to England and he comes back with, I would say with an attitude. Life has passed him by. He's been stuck there. He's got no wife. He's got no children. He's got no land. He's got nothing. And he wants to just go for it. And that's what he does. He very quickly takes control of an English army and goes back over to France to fight. But he's very rash. He's not very disciplined. He doesn't know what he's doing. And he stumbles into quite a few terrible campaigns. And his reputation is destroyed. He comes back to England and he falls out with his cousin, the king, Henry VI. He falls out of favour with the King's Council and he's sent to his one of his castles in disgrace. And then he suddenly dies. Now, one chronicler does say he does this by his own hand. And of course, the story that's come down to us is that John Beaufort died by suicide because he was in disgrace. But I would question that. He could have died just from stress. He has been put into disgrace. Everything's been taken away from him. His life is a shambles. There's one source that tells us he died by suicide was actually a very hostile source to him. You see, the source is something called the Croyland Chronicle, and it was written by an abbot at Croyland. But John Beaufort had engaged in a personal feud with this abbot. So I wonder, has this abbot simply written, I have heard it said John died by suicide, to almost slander his reputation further in death? Because to die by suicide in the 15th century in a Catholic world was a one-way ticket to hell. You were a sinner in death. So I don't know, and I don't think anyone knows how John Beaufort died, but the upshot is, when Margaret Beaufort is only one, John Beaufort dies, and she remains his only child and his only heir. So everything he has devolves upon this young child.
How did his death affect Margaret's position? Obviously, she gets all of what was in his lifetime, but was it hers to own, or was she put in a wardship?
Well, yeah, I mean, because she's a child and therefore in minority, she doesn't get to, personally wield the fortune, even if she was old enough to do so. She is the heiress to a considerable fortune and the inheritor of quite a slim, but nonetheless a claim to the throne. During this period, the 1440s, Henry VI, Margaret's cousin, is on the throne, but he doesn't have a child. His uncles, who would be next in line, do not have children of their own. There is no one there to be the Lancastrian heir. Now, across the political divide, there is the House of York, and they do have a good claim to the throne further up the line. But Margaret Beaufort is Henry VI's cousin. She's connected to the House of Lancaster. And by that, she also had a claim to the throne. Arguably, within the House of Lancaster, she's next in line at this point. People forget that. Um, and for this reason, she's very important as a young girl. And as a young girl with an incredible inheritance that she will one day own, there are a lot of people who want to marry their children to her. And one of these is a chap called William de la Pole, the Earl and then the Duke of Suffolk. And he's one of the most powerful people in England during this period. He's effectively the man running the country for Henry VI. And he gets an agreement from the king that he can marry his son John to Margaret Beaufort. Margaret Beaufort's only, 3 or 4 years old at this point. She's got no control over this. She has simply said, yes, you can marry Margaret. We'll make the agreement and your son can marry Margaret. Now, in 1450, when Margaret Beaufort is 7 years old, the Duke of Suffolk falls. He's too powerful, but he's also too unpopular. And his enemies have been circling the waters for a long time. And they finally capture him. They take him out on a small boat into the English Channel and they chop his head off. So Suffolk falls. Now, one of the accusations levied at the Duke of Suffolk in Parliament is that he actually intended, through the marriage of his son to Margaret Beaufort, to use her claim to the throne so that his descendants could one day be kings themselves. They said that he was planning to take over the throne. And this is very interesting because we were always told that Henry Tudor in 1485 almost invents his mother's claim to the throne out of nowhere to become a king of England. But as early as 1450, people are already saying Margaret Beaufort is a very important person, even though she's 7 years old, and she has this great inheritance in her blood. So I think that is very important to note.
Would you say that Margaret was a well-educated woman?
Yeah, absolutely. One of her later, what we say, friends, biographers, was a guy called Bishop John Fisher, who would ultimately lose his head to Margaret's grandson, Henry VIII, during the English Reformation. And he notes that as a child, Margaret was a girl of singular wisdom. She was a very clever and educated child. She had a decent childhood. She was raised at Bletsoe, initially with her mother, and she was raised around a troop of siblings, half siblings even, because she was her father's only child, but her mother already had children from a previous marriage. And it was here, raised in this loving home, that she did learn things, how to read, how to write, how to embroider. We know as an adult she was a very clever woman. This starts in childhood. To be a clever adult, you must have something about you as a child. So yeah, she certainly was well educated, and she would later want to see education spread. That would be one of her great legacies.
Obviously, you just mentioned that she was engaged or she was meant to marry William de la Pole. It was William, wasn't it?
John de la Pole, the
Sorry,
son of William.
sorry, John de la Pole. How did that not happen and it came to that she married Edmund Tudor instead?
So, with the fall of William de la Pole, the Duke of Suffolk, that marriage was very quickly broken up. The king didn't now want his cousin to marry a disgraced family. And because the marriage had been conducted before she was the age of 12, under church law, she never gave her agreement to it. So it was broken. And that's interesting. And Margaret herself later doesn't consider this to have been one of her marriages, which is why some people say she had 3 marriages, other people say she had 4. But very quickly, she's married again. And this is to somebody called Edmund Tudor, one of those Welsh Tudors we were discussing earlier. Now, this is fascinating because what we see here is Henry VI, who has no child at the moment to take over the Lancastrian throne. He marries his cousin Margaret Beaufort, who has a claim to the English throne, to his half-brother Edmund Tudor. Now, Edmund Tudor has no claim to the English throne whatsoever. He is half Welsh and half French, but he is the half-brother of King Henry VI. And I would suggest what Henry VI is trying to do is he wants his cousin and his half-brother to marry so that they create this new Tudor Lancastrian line. And I think that is very interesting. Not a lot of people ever consider that possibility. Now, shortly after she does marry Edmund Tudor, Henry VI does finally have a son. So whatever plans were being put in play here became irrelevant because the king, in the end, had a son of his own.
We know that Margaret was it 12 years old she was when she married Edmund?
Yep, she was 12 years old.
Was it unusual for Margaret's marriage to be consummated at 12?
Absolutely. So this is a very difficult topic to talk about
Mm.
because Margaret Beaufort was married at 12 years old to Edmund Tudor, and that in itself is fairly not quite standard, but not unusual. 12 years old is the age the church gives for a female to marry, 14 for a boy. And that happens throughout nobility, children being married to get these alliances underway. But the consummation of the marriage at 12 years old is certainly not standard for the day. We know today 12-year-olds are considered in modern society to be children. It wasn't so different back then. Legally, perhaps yes, but genetically, biologically, they are still children. And people understood you could not consummate a marriage at that age. It would be dangerous. For noblewomen, we're looking at about 16 years old. For everyday women, you're looking as late as 21, 22, because they need to be around helping the household. So 12 years old was disastrously early, even for that age. And that's important because too many people think it was normal for the 15th century, and therefore we shouldn't sympathize with Margaret Beaufort. I've heard that said many times, and it's absurd. 12 years old was shocking to have a marriage consummated, even more so when we learn Edmund Tudor was 26 years old.
I mean, obviously it's a difficult topic and even then it was frowned upon. But we know Margaret does get pregnant from from whenever, and she gives birth to Henry Tudor, our first Tudor king. Did the birth cause damage to Margaret's body?
The historian answer is we don't know.
Mm.
We don't have medical records. And it is often stated as a fact that this birth damaged Margaret Beaufort. And we've got to be careful and say we don't know. However, historians, we can only look at what we know and try and make judgment. And my judgment would be yes, I think so, because she was very small, and it was remarked upon by later chroniclers that her life was in peril because she was of very small stature. She was a child, she was 12. And despite multiple marriages afterwards, she never had, there's no evidence whatsoever she was pregnant or had a child again. So obviously the assumption is whether she physically was unable to or perhaps mentally
Mm.
unable to. This clearly affected her deeply moving forward. But of course, the upshot is by her having this one child who was born in such great difficulty to her, she became utterly devoted to him for the rest of her life.
Margaret's husband actually dies, Edmund Tudor dies when she's pregnant with Henry. What happened to Margaret after her husband died, but then she gave birth to her son as well?
Yeah, so this is, she's a pregnant mother at 12 years old and widowed. I mean, it's a remarkable um, scenario that she's faced with. Her son is born 3 months after Edmund dies and is instantly raised by his uncle, Jasper Tudor. Margaret Beaufort, despite being a mother and a widow at 12, she's still underage. she has no control over her own life at this point. She's a child, and therefore her wardship passes from her dead husband to his brother Jasper Tudor, and Jasper is responsible for the child. Margaret, however, this is going to sound bad, but it would be considered she's a drain on Jasper Tudor's resource. He can't do anything with her, and he can't continue to fund her. So a husband has got to be found for her quickly. And during this period, the Wars of the Roses has already got underway. It's a conflict taking place all across England and Wales, and families are starting to mobilise into their positions. What Jasper decides to do is create a political alliance that would protect him in Wales. One of the most powerful noblemen in Wales, or who has lands in Wales, is the Duke of Buckingham, a great Lancastrian noble, a man of his own royal blood, and an ally to Jasper Tudor. And the Duke of Buckingham has a younger son called Henry Stafford, who needs some money and some homes and some castles. So it's very quickly a deal is made. Margaret Beaufort marries Henry Stafford. This way, Margaret Beaufort has a husband to take care of her. Henry Stafford gets Margaret's money and lands, or at least some of them. So that's perfect for both of them. They get what they need. And Jasper Tudor and the Duke of Buckingham get a political alliance. So this happens very quickly. We're talking months after the birth. And Margaret Beaufort is removed from Pembroke Castle, where her son was born, and she's sent on her way to live with her new husband, probably back home for her in Northamptonshire, where she still owns, where she technically owns loads of manors and castles, which are now being controlled by her husband.
Do we know much about Margaret's marriage? And do we know if she was allowed to visit Henry as well?
This marriage actually does seem to be quite a content marriage. She was young. The husband was in his 30s, but he already had, I believe he already had children and didn't really have any need for children with Margaret. So it was just a marriage of convenience, but one that, based on the small amounts we know, was quite uneventful, which is a good thing. It just kind of went with the flow. They were just on the periphery of the Yorkist court, two people left to their own business in Northamptonshire. Margaret does visit Henry Tudor at least once in the next 10 years. We know that, what we should say at this point is Henry Tudor is a victim of the Wars of the Roses as a child, and he is actually removed from Pembroke Castle and sent to live with a Yorkist family called the Herberts at Raglan Castle. But nonetheless, even though Henry is now being raised by his enemies, or his family's enemies, he is raised well. He is given a good education by the Herbert family. And Margaret does go to visit him at least once. She takes some money, she takes some bows and arrows for him to learn, and she writes letters. We don't know how many times she visited, but it probably wouldn't be much. But we have evidence of at least of this one visit, which is quite poignant. She's not being raised with a son already, but that is to be expected in many respects for the period.
Do we know if Margaret and her second husband spent much time at the Yorkist court?
We don't know too much. I'm sure they would have been in and out of the court at times, but her husband Henry Stafford was the son of a great Lancastrian noble. I think his father actually died fighting for the Lancastrians. His brother died as well fighting for the Lancastrians, so they probably were just kept at quite an arm's length, just getting on with business.
Is there any evidence that Margaret had any involvement in the two uprisings between 1469 and 1471?
So this is the period where Warwick the Kingmaker and the King Edward IV's brother, George Duke of Clarence, rebel against the Yorkist crown. So it's almost like a a fracture within the House of York. This is, Margaret's not involved in these rebellions. No, she's not part of them. She's still a young woman at this time, but she does take the opportunity to ask Warwick if Clarence would give some of the lands back, because what's happened in the previous period is her son, Henry Tudor, because his father died before he was born, Henry Tudor was born and was Earl of Richmond from birth. But because he's from a Lancastrian family, the Yorkist King Edward IV took the earldom and the lands away from Henry Tudor. He disinherited him. So what Margaret Beaufort is doing is she's asking Warwick the Kingmaker at this point, if you do take control of the kingdom, can you ask your little friend Clarence, who has been given the earldom and the lands, can I have them back? So she's not involved in the uprisings, but she sees an opportunity at least to ask the question.
Margaret's second husband dies from wounds suffered at the Battle of Barnet. How quickly did Margaret remarry, and to who?
I think what's important to point out is 1471, which is this year that her husband suffered the injuries, is a traumatic year for Margaret Beaufort because the Wars of the Roses have kicked off big time. The Lancastrians have briefly taken back the throne, which is good for Margaret. She's a Lancastrian, but then they lose the throne again very quickly. And this time, her son, a 14-year-old son at this point, is chased abroad because he has Lancastrian blood in his veins and he's at risk of being killed by the House of York. But luckily for him, he's not captured. He gets in a boat and he sails away across the sea. So Margaret has seen her son. Well, first of all, she's seen her cousin, Henry VI, be killed. She's seen all of her Beaufort family be killed. And she's seen her son be chased abroad, who would have been killed if he hadn't gone onto that boat. At the same time, her husband is fighting for the Yorkists. And Margaret's got to, put up with this. Her husband has seen the opportunity that I think things are better off for the Yorkists, not for the Lancastrians. And God knows what kind of conversations that pair had. But he does suffer the injuries and he does eventually die. So Margaret Beaufort is once again a widow. Now, what's interesting is that, again, it's not palatable to say these days, but she is a woman and she does need a marriage, for security, for stability. But her decision with her new husband is very interesting. 1 year later, in 1472, she marries a guy called Thomas Stanley, a very powerful but untitled nobleman in the northwest of England. And this is a marriage of convenience for both people. Thomas Stanley has plenty of children already. He doesn't want children. He does enjoy the idea of being married to a very powerful heiress with great inheritance, so it works for him. Margaret Beaufort, however, she picks him because Thomas Stanley is a rising power in the Yorkist court. He is very well liked by Edward IV. And what Margaret is seeing here is an opportunity to hitch her wagon to a rising force in the Yorkist court. What she can do from this position is go to court with Thomas Stanley and start to petition the king to let her son come home and let her son live. And this is exactly what she does. She advocates for her son throughout the 1470s, through her husband, to let her son come home. And we know that Margaret Beaufort does get quite close to the Yorkist court. She becomes quite close with Queen Elizabeth Woodville. At one point, Margaret becomes godmother to one of the king and queen's daughters. So she's very close to the Yorkist crown. And she is constantly asking, can my son come home? And Edward IV says, no.
We know that Edward IV suddenly died in April 1483, and the next few months are a widely discussed and debated subject. What What role did Margaret play in these few months?
A huge role. So, 10 years she'd asked for her son to come home, and Edward IV had said no. In 1482, he finally says, "Okay, let's have a chat, Margaret. Come to me, let's have a chat." Margaret says, "Please, your lord, you've been king for 10 years. You're fine. My son's going to be no problem to you. Just let him come home. Let him become Earl of Richmond. And I've got all my lands I just want to give to him. That's all. No more, no less. He will be loyal to you. Maybe he might even marry one of your daughters." And Edward the Fourth, by this point, big, fat, flushed with success. He's killed all of his enemies. He's confident, overconfident perhaps. And he says, "Yeah, okay, I'll let your son come home." And he actually signs a pardon for Henry Tudor. He says, if Henry Tudor comes home, he's aged 26 at this point. If he comes home after 14 years stuck abroad and bends the knee to me and accepts me as king, I will give him his lands and it's okay. And Edward the Fourth writes this pardon. But before the pardon can be signed and put into Parliament, Edward the Fourth dies. Now, without going into too much detail, 78 days later, after his death, it's his brother who is king, Richard III. He stepped aside and stepped over his nephews, who we remember as the Princes in the Tower, and Richard III becomes king. The day before his coronation, he has a meeting with Margaret Beaufort in London. We don't know what was said in that meeting. I believe Margaret Beaufort has asked Richard III, "Are you going to honour what your brother said and let my son come home?" Richard says no. Margaret Beaufort comes straight out of that meeting and begins immediately plotting Richard's downfall. She immediately starts writing letters to the Princess in the Tower's mother, Elizabeth Woodville, who is in hiding, saying, "I will help you. Let's team up. Let's bring Richard III down. We will do this by marrying my son to your daughter. Let's go." So Margaret Beaufort absolutely is up to her neck in conspiracy against Richard III. She is the mover and shaker during these years, trying to get this plot going because she wants her son home. This is not about him becoming King of England, not yet. This is about, I want my son home and I want him home now. And I'm going to do this because poor Elizabeth Woodville, her children have probably been murdered, and we're all going to team up and we're going to destroy this nasty King Richard. And she has lots of money. She's able to send messengers around the country. She's sending money across the sea to her son and telling him, "We've got a plan here. We're going to lead a rebellion. We're going to come back and we're going to kill Richard III." And it's magnificent, and it does work. It fails initially. One attempted invasion collapses, but as the next 2 years go by, this plotting and intrigue works, and it ultimately results in Henry Tudor remarkably invading, using his mother's claim to say that I have a right to be King of England, and then toppling and killing Richard III. And the key ingredient in all of this is the Stanleys, because the Stanleys, remember, are now married to Margaret Beaufort. And throughout this 2 year period, nobody knows where they stand. Outwardly, they are very loyal to Richard III. But privately, Thomas Stanley is Henry Tudor's stepfather. He is looking at this picture and going, do I stand with my king? Or could my king one day be, could my stepson one day be king? And at the last moment, at the Ball of Bosworth, the Stanleys make their choice. And the choice they make is on behalf of Henry Tudor. And we just know. Imagine when Margaret Beaufort, the pressure she must have been putting on her husband for these 2 years. Many historians have believed that the Stanleys made a spur-of-the-moment decision in the battle. I think they always knew what they were going to do. I think the deal had always been done. It was just they had to bide their time and not jump too early. And they made the perfect choice. I mean, Henry Tudor's stepfather, Thomas Stanley, becomes Earl of Derby after the battle. That's his reward. And today, the current Earl of Derby is the 19th Earl of Derby, Edward Stanley, and he's worth £600 million. And all of that stems from Thomas Stanley's decision to pick the right side.
I mean, you can just imagine Margaret saying, "Don't bother coming home if you're not going to support my son."
Yeah.
How much did the Battle of Bosworth change Margaret's life?
Well, obviously it changed it dramatically because she was now not just Lady Margaret, husband of Thomas Stanley. She was um, My Lady the King's Mother, as the title that she gave herself. She was um, the most powerful woman in the country. Um, it's very interesting. People wonder why she didn't become queen herself, since it was her claim. England was not ready for that, unfortunately. There was no question whatsoever of her becoming queen herself. Her son Henry Tudor was king because he was king by conquest. That was his title. Uh, luckily for England, Margaret's granddaughters would become the first queens of England. For Margaret herself, it wasn't on the table, and nor does she expect it to be. There was no desire from her to rule. What she wanted more than anything was full control of her own life. Independence, liberty. This is what she sought for herself. And it's very interesting that in the very first Parliament of England, an act is passed saying that Margaret could enjoy the rights to all of her titles, all of her properties, and she could effectively live like a femme sole, as if she was a single woman. She had no need to defer to her husband. Her husband was not in control of her land, her titles. She was. It's a remarkable story and a remarkable insight into her own frame of mind. She very much had regal bearing, and she believed and cherished her lands and her power and her control, which her son was similar minded. These are two people who have had no control of their entire lives, and once they've seized power, they're not giving up an iota of control to anybody ever again.
How much power and influence did Margaret have at the Tudor court, and especially with her son as well?
Officially, she doesn't have much power. It's not like she has an official job or official role. But certainly she was able to exert some influence upon her son. I think the idea of there being some power behind her son's throne, standing next to him, is completely overdone. Her son and his counselors, they were in full control of of the kingdom, but she certainly did have some influence. I could make some suggestions to her son. We obviously know that she started signing her name as Margaret R. Um, the R could stand for Richmond, her noble title, but she had earlier signed her name as M. Richmond, but she switched it to Margaret R. She's probably saying Margaret Regina for, you know, queen, a princess. So she definitely was sure of her own power. In 1498, so we're talking 13 years into the reign, a Spanish ambassador does actually write that Henry VII is much influenced by his mother. And people again have taken it to mean she had control. You can be influenced by your mother in various things, handing out titles, giving out rewards, but it doesn't mean she had a hand in government. They can be two separate things. But certainly Henry was very deferential to his mother. He loved his mother, he adored his mother, and she adored him. And they sought to make their lives, I guess, as pleasant as it could be. Now they had all the funds and all the power they could have.
Henry does marry Elizabeth Woodville's eldest daughter, Elizabeth of York. Do we know if Margaret got along with her daughter-in-law?
We will never truly know because there's a very deep shortage of documents from either. Elizabeth did not leave a diary saying, I hate my mother-in-law. What I will say about this is Margaret had known Elizabeth since she was a child. The entire life they'd known each other. And then Elizabeth was married to Henry um, for, let me do the math, 15, 16, 17 years, 18 years even, by the time she died. That's a long time, a long marriage, and a long period in which mother-in-law and daughter-in-law can fall out over the smallest of things. We all fall out with family members all the time. It doesn't mean you don't get on. The problem we have when people discuss whether Margaret and Elizabeth got on is there is one single source written in 1497 by a Spanish ambassador who hated Henry VII, who made an offhand comment that the king's mother has much power and the queen, Elizabeth of York rather, does not like it. I mean, that could have been one bad day where they bickered. It doesn't mean they got on. It doesn't mean they didn't get on. I would imagine across a long reign, they fell out the made up plenty of times. What we do know is there's plenty of evidence of them working together. They even worked together on one occasion to prevent Henry VII sending his daughter Margaret Tudor to Scotland too early. Henry Tudor has to write to the King of Scotland going, I can't send my daughter to you yet. My mother and my wife won't let me. So we know that they teamed up. It would have just been a simple human story. No, no more, no less can we say about it.
Is it true, or do you think it's true, that Margaret played a role in the early retirement of Elizabeth Woodville?
Um, Unknown. Again, this whole period is a very complex period. We don't know. First and foremost, we don't know why Elizabeth Woodville went to Bermondsey Abbey, why she retired. And based on that very standing point, everything else that follows is theory. I can theory that Elizabeth Woodville chose to go to Bermondsey Abbey because she was sick and she wanted to have some care of the monks. I can theory Elizabeth Woodville retired there because she wanted to go grieve for her two sons. Other people have theorized that she went to Bermondsey Abbey because she was kicked out by Margaret Beaufort and Henry VII because she was part of plots. We don't know. We have no idea why Elizabeth Woodville went to Bermondsey Abbey, and just from that starting point, everything is conjecture.
What role did Margaret take at court when Elizabeth of York died in 1503?
So this is quite an important part of the story because at this moment, Henry falls apart. He completely falls apart in grief when his wife dies so shortly after his son. And Margaret has to come down from her palace in Corley Weston and try and, corral everybody to keep going. Because it's in this kind of moments that plot and rebellion can start to sow. If a husband doesn't have his hands on the gear, somebody else might come in. So she does come down and just ensures through her influence, through people respecting her, from her own network of contacts to make sure that people are just plowing ahead and no one's going to try and usurp the throne from beneath. So it's very good that she is on hand there, just to remind everybody, your king is your king. Remember that, everybody.
Obviously, in 1502, Prince Arthur died, which meant the future Henry VIII was now heir to the throne. Did Margaret have any helping hand to educate Henry on how to be a king?
I mean, a lot of Henry's education itself, before he was the next in line, was taken by his mother, Elizabeth of York. And then once he becomes next in line, it's taken up by his father a lot of the case. He obviously has scores and scores of poets and scholars educating him on a daily basis. But the evidence suggests he was kept very close to his father, and his father was trying to impart his own understanding of what it meant to be king. Based on how Henry VIII ended up being, I don't think he listened very much. But there isn't much of, we can't say there's much of Margaret Beaufort's direct influence there, at least. But, Henry would have known his grandmother very well. He would have been around her. He would have seen how she carried herself. She would have given an example, an absolute example of what it meant to be royal. She was a proud woman and she had very definite ideas on things like court etiquette, and how one carries themselves, how one behaves. Young Henry must have picked up some of that.
Where was Margaret when her son died, and do we know what her next moves were?
So Margaret was, again, she'd been around court for a while because her son had been ill for several years, and multiple times his death was feared for. And he kept on rallying, until finally in 1509, his body could take it no longer and he dies. And he dies in Richmond Palace, the great palace he built on the Thames that he named after his own title, the Earl of Richmond. And Margaret is very close by, and this must have been very distressing for her because she was devoted to her son and he was devoted to her. I mean, she had a deeply, deeply felt loyalty, love, and affection for the son she gave birth to at 13 years old, and Henry was devoted likewise. It must have been horrific for her to see her son die, and very distressing because Margaret seems to have been anxious throughout her entire life that every time something good happened, something bad would follow. Even when her son became king, she was fearful what would come next. This is a concept called fortune's wheel. When you're on top, your wheel is going to spin and you're going to hit rock bottom. And it's at this moment where she's starting to worry, oh God, what next? Now my son's died. Is there going to be war again? What's going to become of my grandchildren? These are all distressing thoughts going through her mind. And she's in place to try and make sure the succession goes forward. She was made the chief executor of her son's will. And for 2 days afterwards, after his death, she is there in Richmond making sure the succession is in place. They kept the death quiet for 2 days so they could get in position so if there was an uprising or if there was a plot, they would be ready. What we've got to understand about this period is that no father had left the crown to their son uncontested in 87 years. This is truly Henry VII and Margaret Beaufort's greatest victory. They were able to end all the dynastic wars, not at Bosworth 24 years earlier, but by this moment, making sure the crown goes from the dead father's head to the 17-year-old boy, Henry VIII. And Margaret Beaufort is the conduit there in the middle, making sure that happens. Again, we can't say for definite what exactly steps she was taking, but her presence is felt through her influence, through her connections, and through her sheer-minded determination to see her family strive for greatness, I guess.
How did Margaret help Henry VIII start being a king? Obviously he was only 18 years old.
Margaret dies very quickly after this, so there isn't much that she does other than, I suppose, remind young Henry VIII. It's not like he's come from nowhere at this point. He's been raised for the last 10 years for this moment to remember his education, remember the example set to him by his father. The mark that she principally leaves on her grandson is she effectively picks who the members of his council should be. Or rather, she tells him, I suggest you pick these councillors. These councillors are good men. I trust them. They know what they're doing. Grandson, I believe you should pick these people. And Henry VIII does pick those people. He goes with his grandmother's pick. And that is the real mark she leaves. she puts the people in place for the 17-year-old to work things out in coming years. Unfortunately, once he does work things out, he obviously goes crazy. But for this moment, he listens to his grandmother, he takes her picks, and it ensures smooth succession. You don't want to be doing anything rash or anything wild at this point. Just wear your crown, get crowned, marry Catherine of Aragon, and chill out. Just let the men, the experienced men, do their job. And that's the lesson Margaret left. But unfortunately, she was already quite ill at this time, so we don't see her presence around for much longer.
Where was Margaret when she began to fall ill?
So Margaret begins to, well, I mean, we don't know how long she'd been ill for, but her death doesn't come out of nowhere. But we certainly know that she was in Westminster when this illness entered its final moments. And the reason she was in Westminster is because her grandson was being crowned king. She was there for the coronation. Now, she actually dies the day after her grandson's 18th birthday, just 5 days after he was crowned king. I think this is 2 months after the death of her own son. So, all of these things, a lot is happening, a lot of ups and downs, and she does have this lingering illness. Legend has it that she ate a cygnet, a baby swan, a young swan, at the coronation dinner. And this just didn't work well for her constitution, and she died. She died in the Abbot's house in Westminster Abbey. I think the 29th of June, 1509. And this is quite poignant because that's where her dead son was lying. He was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey. She's in Westminster Abbey. She dies there close to where her son's remains are. A couple of days after her grandson has been crowned. And by being crowned, the job is complete. No one can take that crown from him now. And she passes away. And I think it's quite sweet that how people remembered her at this point. Bishop John Fisher, again, her most devout and loyal follower, her personal confessor, a man who Henry VIII would put to death 20 years later. He wrote all of England for her death had cause for weeping. And Polydore Virgil, a court biographer who knew Margaret, simply called her a woman most outstanding. And in many ways, it's sad that she died at this time, but it marks a very clear break with the past and start with the new. The Wars of the Roses are over. The two final main figures have now passed away within 2 months. The newly crowned Henry VIII, a magnificent and very impressive young man, can go forward towards greatness. I mean, not the greatness we all hoped it would go towards, but certainly at the time, that's how it was viewed. The old are gone, it's time for the new.
Does Margaret have a legacy?
Oh, yes, of course. Margaret's one of the most remarkable women this country's ever had. And I think it's a deep shame that in the modern period, through the works of fiction, her reputation is coming under attack for no good reason whatsoever. We live in an age of female empowerment, and it's sad to see female writers, principally, and female social media users destroy one of the greatest females we've ever had in this country. She was a patron of the arts. She supported the printing industry. She translated books of her own. She was a champion of education. She helped erect some of the greatest colleges in this country. She was an enthusiastic supporter of chapels, of religion. She was a true Renaissance woman. If she was a man, we'd be remembering her far greatly for these accomplishments than we do, unfortunately. I like what Bishop Fisher said about her at her funeral. Bishop Fisher goes on this eulogy, and I appreciate that eulogies given at funerals are hardly ever going to say bad things about the recently departed. But he mentioned things like how she was bounteous and liberal to all person. She was very easy to talk to. She was of marvelous gentleness to all folks. That's a lovely phrase, marvelous gentleness unto all folks. And she would not be unkind to any creature. You know, she comes across as a very kind, loving person, and it's key that nobody living within her day who knew her ever says anything bad about her. We have nothing on record that's negative about her, other than, like her son, she might have been a bit avaricious, a bit, greedy for the money. That's the only thing. But I think when we think about her ultimate legacy, her bloodline still sits on the throne of England, the throne of the United Kingdom today. You know, Charles III is her direct descendant, and every single monarch after her son, what's that, 500 years of monarchs, everyone was descended from her. When we think back to that scared little girl in a Welsh castle, 12 years old, in 1457, pregnant, widowed, scared, that's remarkable. But that is what ended up being her legacy.
And Margaret is just an incredible woman, and I agree with you about the fiction, how fiction is depicting her at the moment. Before I let you go, I like to ask my guests 5 fun Tudor questions. So, firstly, have you got a Tudor or a history pet peeve?
Yeah, people who don't listen are not willing to listen to all sides of an argument. You know, let's take the Princes of the Tower just um as a study. It's okay for you to have your views on a subject and be given the space to express those views. But you have to then allow other people to have the same space to express their views. You are not right. You have a theory. You have an opinion. Now, within that, of course, you can correct mistakes or errors, but the bottom line is, as a guiding principle, you have to, if you want respect for your own views, you have to be willing to respect other views. And I think that is something we're not seeing often at the moment. Obviously, in life in general, this is a wider issue. But when it comes to history, it's very frustrating, this concept that I'm going to tell you what I think, but you can't tell me what you think. It's difficult.
Have you got a favourite historical film?
I'm going to say Gladiator. Obviously, almost every historical film has its issues with accuracy, and some are better than others. But the bottom line here is that these films are made to entertain. That is what their principal guiding light is. And Gladiator, come on, an hour and a half, you stick there on. Are you not entertained? I'm entertained. It's a remarkable story that really does get goosebumps at various moments throughout it.
What is your favourite historical book? It can be fiction or non-fiction.
I'm not sure in general, but I will say I have recently finished Helen Caster's The Eagle and the Heart. I'm on record repeatedly saying Helen Caster is the greatest writer of narrative non-fiction. She is the greatest of all time, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. So I'm going to say, because it's very fresh in the mind, recency bias, Helen Caster.
Have you got a favourite historical building?
I'm going to say Raglan Castle in Monmouthshire. This is very pertinent to our story today. This is where Henry Tudor lived between the ages of 4 and 10 years old. It is where he got his education. It is where he was brought up, and it's where Margaret Beaufort visited him. It's a remarkable castle with an excellent, if half destroyed, tower, and it's got a very unusual gateway, which is more in the French fashion than the English or the Welsh, and it just makes any visit there quite memorable.
Finally, have you got a favourite historical fact?
Yes. In the year 1483, there were two men called Henry who both had a mother called Margaret Beaufort who were rebelling against Richard III. The first is Henry Tudor, whose mother was, of course, our Margaret Beaufort. The other man was Henry Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham, whose mother was another different Margaret Beaufort. So we have two men trying to kill Richard III, who both had mothers called Margaret Beaufort. And you can see why Ricardians must hate and do hate any mention of Margaret Beaufort.
Thank you so much for coming on today. It's been a joy to speak to you.
Thank you very much. I always enjoy spreading the Margaret Beaufort gospel.
If you enjoyed this episode and you loved all the others, please take the time to rate and review the show.